Are you trapped in a painful cycle of procrastination and perfectionism, which are linked like this in a cycle of anxiety, negative self talk, fear of judgment? We often don't associate the words perfectionist and procrastination together. Yet, I don't think I've ever met a perfectionist who doesn't procrastinate in one way or another. And there's a number of different ways to procrastinate. I'm going to get to that. And while not all procrastination is tied to perfectionism, definitely not, but I'd say a lot of it is, or there are perfectionistic elements that are contributing to it. So, understanding what's underneath this drive to be perfect and what's underneath procrastination can really help you to stop this cycle. So, today I'm going to describe this cycle, talk about the different ways we can procrastinate, because understanding both of those things are going to lead to the third part of this video, which is how you recover from both of these habits. Okay, so the cycle first. So, what is underneath perfectionism? Or I should say, the desire to be perfect, the drive actually to be perfect, because this is different than wanting to do a great job. It's different than wanting to excel in a particular area. Perfectionism is about having unrealistic standards, like really, really top standards that are most likely not achievable, and it's combined with self-criticism, and it's combined with a feeling that your actual worth as a human being is based on whether you can achieve that goal. So while it might on the surface look like a positive thing, ooh, I like to be perfect and I really try hard and I'm really aiming for here. If we go just under the surface, there is a fear of inadequacy, a fear of failure, a fear of disappointing people, a fear of other people's judgments. In general, some sort of feeling of I'm in danger if I'm not perfect, like something bad will happen if I am not perfect, or I'm not lovable if I'm not perfect. And really, truly, I'm not okay as I am. And if we look at this list of what's underneath this drive for perfection, the word fear is mentioned a lot, right? And fear that is not fear like in this moment, I better like run, right? That kind of fear is anxiety. That's what it is. So, not everybody who has perfectionistic tendencies sees perfectionism as anxiety, but to really begin to recover from this, begin to improve your life, your self-esteem, there's a need to recognize this as anxiety. So avoiding procrastination. And then you procrastinate, which then leads to more self-judgment, more anxiety, more negative self-talk. And rather than healing any of those underlying issues, it will just boom, go into more perfectionism. So often we think about procrastination as somebody who just simply doesn't start a task or doesn't start doing what they are supposed to do. And yes, that would be one of the forms of procrastination. But very frequently, for people who have perfectionistic tendencies, the procrastination can actually come in a couple of other forms. So one place procrastination can kick in is after what I'm going to call the big idea stage. Okay, so you are going to tackle some project and the perfectionistic tendencies make you think, oh, this is going to be great. It's going to be just awesome. It's going to be comprehensive and brilliant. So there's really a grand idea, a big picture, big vision, which can be great, can be really fun. But when it is totally unrealistic or not constrained or considered in light of real life constraints, right? Then it can be really overwhelming, so overwhelming we can't move beyond that stage. So that is a time where procrastination can really, really hit the perfectionist. The third way that procrastination hits the perfectionist is not finishing. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with Urban Dictionary. I sometimes find it to be very amusing, but it's kind of current day interpretations of different words. And there's a definition on there for a perfectionist. And I hope you can take this with a sense of humor, which is how it is meant. But the definition is that a perfectionist is a person who does not understand the meaning of the words budget and deadline. So Perfectionists often miss budgets and deadlines because they just want everything to be so, right? Everything to be exact. And if you think about budgeting, not just in terms of money, like for a work project, right? But your own time also, your time needs to be budgeted, right? Our time is our most valuable and most limited resource. And the fourth way that procrastination can show up, which I think this one is really strong in perfectionistic people, is that your perfectionism in a not so important area creates a diversion so you never get to the important stuff. So let me say that again. You get stuck being perfectionistic on a relatively unimportant task, and it's a form of avoiding getting to the important work. So I was sort of laughing as I was thinking about recording this video. I was at the mirror doing my makeup, which I'm not really all that good at, and it is interesting how people will comment on it once in a while. But I know that if you get perfectionistic about how you put your lip liner on or your eyebrows or whatever, you could just spend hours, and people do. And if I really got perfectionistic about it, I'd never sit down in front of the video and create videos, right? And I've mentioned in some of my other videos on perfectionism, doing a YouTube channel, you really have to get over perfectionism because otherwise, forget it. You just cannot get the content out because it'll never be perfect. And if you really, really care about people's opinions and criticisms, I mean, obviously, I do care about people's opinions. I get enough positive feedback that makes doing this channel worthwhile. Oh, as an aside, if you do end up liking this, to hit that like button because it is motivating for me. So it's not that I don't care, right? Why do this if nobody watches? Why do this if people aren't benefiting from it? But I get criticized by all sorts of people, by all sorts of strange things. Some are very relevant, some I incorporate into my next videos, but some of it just isn't. So if you're really hypersensitive to what kind of judgment you'll get for what you're doing, why do it, right? So you would just procrastinate and procrastinate. So that should give you a sense of how all these things are interconnected. And knowing which of these procrastination methods you do the most often, right, will help you figure it out how to come up with a different plan. So I'm going to give you a couple of practical tools, but I'm going to start with the deeper work because again, looking on YouTube or pulling it up on Google, you will find a lot of suggestions about change your mindset. Okay, that's nice. How do I do that, right? So a lot of the advice, which is kind of like do this, is very surface level. And to really recover from perfectionism and the pain it causes you and the procrastination that causes you even more pain, you really have to go to those underlying feelings that are driving this. So let's start with the number one feeling I mentioned, anxiety. If you can recognize your procrastination as a form of anxiety, recognize your perfectionistic tendency as anxiety. So that would mean when you have those thoughts, right, you label it. This is my anxiety. When you have those behaviors of avoidance, you also label it. This is my anxiety. And once you label it, you can take a deep breath, real deep diaphragmatic breath, ground yourself in the moment, let yourself know that you are safe enough. Using that phrase of safe enough can be really, really helpful because understanding that anxiety is a response that means we're in immediate danger. It doesn't cognitively mean that, but chemically, it's telling your body that you're in immediate danger, right? It's adrenaline spikes, cortisol follows. Your body is having a chemical reaction as if you need to run away from that saber-toothed tiger that doesn't exist anymore, right? If we can really see that anxiety as a response that's disconnected from our actual life, it's disconnected from the present moment, you are safe enough whether you do this perfectly or not. And I'm not saying that, okay, you could come up with all sorts of reasons why that's not true. I'll know, I'll get in trouble, I'll lose my job, I'll this or that, someone won't love me, my parents will be mad at me. Whatever the reasons are behind that desire to do something perfectly, none of them require an in the moment, immediate anxiety chemical response. That's where I want you to create a gap. And that gap can be created by really identifying the thought as anxiety, the behavior as anxiety, and the bodily chemicals that are fueling that as a misguided response of the old brain. And therefore, breathing, calming yourself, letting yourself know that you're safe enough. Okay, the number 2 deep issue here are the negative core beliefs. Now, there is no way to solve either that anxiety investigation or negative core beliefs in a 10-minute YouTube video. But identifying what the negative core belief is that's driving your perfectionism is very, very important. And then you can begin to counter it with a positive, adaptive belief. And again, this takes more work. I do have a free resource that might be helpful for you. It's a PDF called Transform Your Negative Core Belief, and it both helps you identify exactly what that 1 or 2 really core negative belief is, and it gives you 3 ways to transform that belief. So those are the big picture issues to tackle here if you are struggling with procrastination and perfectionism. And then on a more practical side, I want to help you come up with a plan that is actually implementable. So coming back to that grand idea stage, recognize you're having it. Recognize that you are having this perfectionistic ideal, which has positive in it. It's motivating. It can be exciting. See the positive in it and let yourself think about it. Maybe set a timer, right? Could be 45 minutes. Okay, that's my grand idea. Now, the next step under grand idea is going to be to put in writing. You can even jot your grand idea down, then put in writing, what are my constraints? Okay, constraints. If I'm at work, I got this budget, I got this time frame. If it's a school project, the project is due on this date. Write down any constraints of material, constraints of support, right? And constraints of the other demands on your time, your money, your materials, right? So I really want you to think through, you are going to try to accomplish this grand idea within constraints so that the limitation or the lack of perfection or the lack of an ideal isn't all about you. It's really not, really, probably for any of us. We all operate in a world with constraints that don't always let us do exactly what we want to do. So put in, and I have actually never seen a video talking about procrastination with this as a suggestion. So I would really like to know what you think of it, whether you implement it. Let me know if it helps or if it works. But I really think it'll be super useful to really write down what are the constraints within which you are operating. Another constraint could be, I have to get my thesis advisor's approval on this, or I have to get my coworkers' buy-in, or I have to get the people who work under me to execute here, right? There's a lot of constraints. And maybe some of the people working under you have strengths here, but not there. And yeah, okay, just spend a little time with the constraints. Don't let it get overwhelming, but bringing in that level of realistic assessment, really, really helpful. Then I want you to apply the 80-20 rule. And depending how long this project is that you're working on, whether it's like a one-night paper or a 6-month project at work, the 80-20 rule should be brought in for each stage. The 80-20 rule is that we get 80% of the work done in 20% of the time. The last 20% takes 80% of our time. Basically, the bulk of value is created quickly, right? And efficiently. And then that last 20% can take an enormous amount of time. And we need to assess how much of that is worth it, because often 80% is enough. And this 80-20 rule is interesting because it applies to a lot of businesses, that 80% of your business and revenue comes from 20% of your clients. But overall, 80% of the value of something often comes from 20% of the effort. So continually bringing that to mind. And with that 80-20 rule in mind, set out a plan. Set out a plan for yourself that thinks through the sequential steps. I don't always like doing the sequential steps, but that's sort of a different issue. But it can really play in here, right? Because sequentially, it's like, oh, to do this piece, which I like, I first have to do that. And then I really should do that before. Yep, there are going to be pieces of this you like to do and pieces you don't like to do. That's just how it is. So set it out sequentially, right? And then prioritize what are the biggest impact pieces for you to focus on. And then you can set your priorities. So you set your priorities with both taking into account the sequence needed, right? What's the stumbling block before you get to do this, and the 80-20, what's the biggest impact? All right, so you have now come up with the steps to develop a plan and a priority list. So when you put on your calendar, the priority for today is to, whatever, film this video, and you find you're not doing it, that's when you go back to those first two steps, identifying it as anxiety, identifying the negative core belief under it, trying to approach it with a good enough attitude. I'm a good enough person. My work will be good enough. It's just going to be good enough. And often that is enough. And the last little piece I want to say here is to have a bit of a sense of humor about that impulse of your brain that is telling you you have to be perfect, because a sense of humor can help to lighten things up a little bit. A sense of humor often helps us to put things into perspective. And that reminds me of another really good tool. It's zooming out. It's really zooming out and looking at what's happening from a very far away distance. That's a really good tool for perspective. But anyway, coming back to the humor, because our brains kind of go in bizarre directions sometimes and get stuck on little tiny things. And if we can begin to observe our thoughts instead of always being sucked totally into them, our lives can be much more joyful. And that also brings up that all or nothing thinking that is often underneath perfectionism. And I do have a video on that I'll link here at the end. And I hope this was super helpful, and I'll see you next week.